Alexander Ramsay was a Minnesota politician who achieved recognition on the national stage, and a lot of people don't realize that. He was not from Minnesota originally. He and his wife were both from Pennsylvania. He was born outside of Harrisburg in 1815, and he rose through the ranks in various ways. He started his career as a lawyer in Pennsylvania and then became involved in the Whig Party, served in Congress for Pennsylvania, and that's how he made a few connections that would help him later on in his life, including working for President Zachary Taylor on his re-election campaign. And Taylor was so grateful for the work that Ramsay did for him, he wanted to appoint him the first Territorial Governor of Minnesota in 1849. So Mr. Ramsay went on to have a career ranging from first Territorial Governor in Minnesota, Mayor of St. Paul, to second elected State Governor of Minnesota, U.S. Senator on behalf of Minnesota, serving in Washington, and also Secretary of War for President Hayes. We're not sure exactly why Taylor chose Alexander Ramsay to be the first territorial governor in Minnesota. Records show that actually Ramsay was Taylor's third choice. So you always think, wow, what if history went a different direction? Who would the other people have been that could have been out here? But Ramsay did accept. We know that at first he and his wife were a little hesitant to come out to this area. St. Paul in 1849 was very much a fur trading village, very small, certainly not the capital city that we know today in our modern day. And his wife, supposedly, to kind of show her sense of humor, supposedly said to him, "Minnesota? Well, where upon earth is that? Denmark?" It was a very unfamiliar place to people back in the eastern part of the United States. But as a good wife in those days, she realized that her fortunes lay with her husband and that they would end up moving to St. Paul. And they arrived here then in May of 1849. Well, the house that we're in right now was completed in 1872. It took 4 years to build. They started construction in 1868, and then in September of 1872, Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay and their daughter Marian moved in. Previously to this house being built, they called it their mansion house, and Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay got the idea for building their mansion house from the years they spent in Washington, D.C. when he was United States Senator from Minnesota. It was the same style they were seeing built in the fancy Georgetown suburb of D.C. So they knew that when they would get back to Minnesota, they really wanted to have their mansion reflective of what was being built on the East Coast, kind of that sign that they had arrived and a home that they felt that they deserve, both for a family home but also for entertaining and showing what he specifically had achieved. We have over 14,000 original artifacts that are attached to this site, and that's pretty remarkable for any historic site, especially for a house museum. And a lot of the collections are stored here on site. Some are also stored at the Minnesota History Center here in St. Paul. This is the reception room that would have been used as a visiting space by the family. Essentially, if you would have been here as an upper class lady, specifically visiting Mrs. Ramsay, she would have special places in the home where she would visit with you, and this was one of those spaces. It was a room designed to impress visitors. It would only be used, well, usually only used during the day. If you had a dinner party here in the evening, the ladies might adjourn in here for some lemonade or some very ladylike beverage, while the guys maybe had brandy or cigars somewhere else in the house. But that would have been the intended use of this room, to impress very much a public space. One of the wonderful things in here is an 1872 Steinway grand piano that was made specifically for the Ramsay's daughter Marian, and that was one of her gifts upon her completion of her musical studies after her year in Dresden, Germany. And it still is in working condition. It is something that we do play as often as we possibly can to keep it in good working condition. At that point in time, Steinway Company would make pianos essentially made to order, and so one of the other pianos being made by the Steinway Company in 1872, at the same time as Marian Ramsay's, was for one of Queen Victoria's daughters, and we know that from a letter that Marian Ramsay wrote to a friend of hers. One of the other items in here, there's several portraits. One in particular is of Alexander Ramsay. We would have that in here. That was about how he looked when he became Territorial Governor of Minnesota in 1849. As Territorial Governor, since you were appointed by the President, there were also policies that you were going to be expected to carry out. But we know that one of the main things that Taylor was sending Ramsay out to do was to get land. This was certainly the time of what people were calling the manifest destiny in the United States. And it was time for, in many people's minds, in the mindset of that era, to be gaining more land. And so starting in 1850, 51, there were treaties that were being negotiated with both the Ojibwe and the Dakota people in this region, and Alexander Ramsay was expected to take part in that, and he did. And in 1851, there were two major treaties with the Dakota, the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux and the Treaty of Mendota. And what those did is opened up for settlement the area that we would call southern Minnesota, from kind of the Minneapolis-St. Paul region down south to what would become then the Iowa border. And then later on in time, there were various treaties with the Ojibwe. But what happened then is certainly the settlers were allowed to come in, but then the Dakota people specifically were forced onto reservations in the Minnesota River Valley. And that set up kind of a house of cards that would come falling down many years later in 1862 in the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. Very tragic part of Minnesota history, but a really important part of history to know about, and a part of history that had national implications. A lot of people throughout the country don't realize that lots of the treaties and also then the failure of these treaties and annuity payments, harsh treatment of the Dakotas, primarily on the reservations, would result in bloodshed years later. Well, this is the spot in the house that Alexander Ramsay used as his office later in his career. It was originally a guest room, but later on in his life, after he had already served as U.S. Senator, this then became his office space. So if you had business up here or business with him, you would meet with him up here. There's also a lot of artifacts or mementos about his time in the various political offices that he held. One of them in particular, most people don't realize that Alexander Ramsay and his wife Anna were actually very good friends of Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln. It's usually a fascinating part of the story that Abraham Lincoln and Alexander Ramsay had already met back in the 1840s when they were both congressmen. Lincoln was, of course, representing Illinois, and Ramsay was representing Pennsylvania. He had not come out to Minnesota yet. So they already had that connection, and then years later, when President Lincoln was in the White House, that was the same time that Alexander Ramsay had been elected second state governor of Minnesota. And of course, one of the things that Mr. Ramsay, Alexander Ramsay, was very proud of was that he happened to be in Washington when the Civil War broke out in April of 1861, and then was able to pledge 1,000 troops on behalf of Minnesota to the Union. And he was able to contact Secretary of War Simon Cameron immediately about that, and Cameron had him write down that offer on paper and then take it directly to President Lincoln. So Governor Ramsay was very proud of him being able to have Minnesota be the distinction, or having the distinguishing characteristic of being the first northern state to offer troops when the Union, or when the Civil War broke out in 1861. Well, one of the other items that actually is in the collections of the Minnesota Historical Society is Alexander Ramsay's journal from April of 1865, and I have it open right now to Friday, April 14th, and also Saturday the 15th. And at that point in time, Alexander Ramsay was Minnesota's U.S. Senator, so that's why he and his wife were living in the International Hotel in Washington. And his entries here reflect a very, tragic time in American history. He writes about, in the middle of his normal daily affairs, he writes about the assassination of President Lincoln. He writes about John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. He mentions the attempt on Secretary Seward and his son Frederick, and then also jumps to then the inauguration of President Johnson, that he was only one of 10 senators present that day, including some from Illinois and also Vermont. He was very proud of that. One thing with Alexander Ramsay, he was always in the right place at the right time, and he always put himself there. And it's fascinating to look through his journal. I mentioned already that some of the things he writes about, they might not be deeply personal, but they're a really great insight into almost what his daily life was like. And it's really important to have these objects to help tell the story, and we're really fortunate in that. Well, later in Alexander Ramsay's political career, after he had already been United States Senator and Governor of Minnesota, he was also then nominated or appointed by President Hayes to be his Secretary of War. So one of the other items here in Alexander Ramsay's office space focuses on his time as Secretary of War for President Hayes. And he served in that position from 1879 to 1881, and then his paper holder dossier he is sitting on the desk. You can clearly see it states his name and then also his title in the Hayes administration. The two men, President Hayes and Alexander Ramsay, had met many years earlier when they were serving in the U.S. Senate. They both had been governors, so they were part of that club of former governors, then U.S. senators, and then, of course, Hayes had become a friend by that point, and then was elected. Later, after his time as Secretary of War, he also still served another presidential administration, kind of overlapping between the Garfield and the Arthur administrations. Kind of little-known committee named the Utah Commission was put together, and they were supposed to explore this quote-unquote problem of what to do with this territory of Utah. People in that area wanted to become a state. They wanted to be admitted to the Union. But there was a problem with that, according to some people, because a lot of the people living in the area were Mormon, and therefore they were practicing polygamy. And the country was very much up in arms about that. So these ex-politicians, including Alexander Ramsay, were sent out to that area where they were supposed to interview people living in that area, find out what really was happening, what they really were doing. The committee never really did end up making any grand decision. Utah was later admitted to the Union, but people felt very strongly about that issue, enough that a special panel or commission was set up. And there's different collections pieces both here at the Ramsay site and also at the Minnesota History Center. But two we have on the desk, one about the whole doctrine of Mormonism, and another one, a pamphlet specifically dealing with plural marriage, that question of polygamy. So there's a lot more issues. Some of those issues we always keep hearing about in the modern day as well. So it's fascinating to know that some of the same issues people in that time period were still wondering how to deal with as well. A lot of people really felt, especially in the later Victorian era and early 1900s, that Alexander Ramsay was one of the people that really helped create what we would consider Minnesota. And you can certainly say that. I think that's fair to say. Again, though, for good or bad, you have to be very conscious about what that means in our modern day. Everything from Ramsey County being named after him, that's where St. Paul is located, to there's a waterfall out in western Minnesota, Alexander Ramsay Falls, at Alexander Ramsay Park in Redwood Falls. So his imprint is in a lot of places, and it's important to realize what he meant at that time. I think Alexander Ramsay was very conscious of what his legacy was, and now looking at his legacy through a 2014 lens, we can gain a better understanding of how controversial but yet compelling his legacy can be, for good or bad. We have to be able to address that head on, and I think that's important to do.